A man and a dog were stranded at sea for 3 days and 3 nights when they finally drifted down the current to a deserted island. The boy set up the canoe as a shelter and began to take stock of what he had left. A box of matches, some fishing line and hooks, and a box of baked cookies. Mark's first choice was to go fishing on the beach, and luckily it wasn't long before he caught a big fish. The first day of being stranded on a deserted island, Mark didn't feel too bad about having hot food. The next morning he took the dog to the sea and dug up some clams. Mark also used fishing line to mend a pair of waterproof shoe covers and played games with the dog on the beach. He and his dad were lost in a storm at sea and he thought that if he waited here for a few days, the rescue team would find him. But after 5 days of waiting, Mark didn't wait for a rescue plane. He smashed the stakes he'd made and piled the wood on top of each other to light a bonfire to signal when a plane would fly over. That day he was sleeping when he heard the sound of an airplane outside. So he got up and ran to the campfire and took out the softwood he had prepared. But he tried several times to light the fire without success. By the time the fire started, he could no longer hear the sound of the airplane. And Mark did not wait for the airplane to fly over again until the fire was extinguished. He wrote his name on the oars and the direction he was going, counted his supplies, and left. After 9 days of waiting with no luck, Mark decided to take the initiative and went out with his dog to a canyon where the waves were too rough to continue. So they had to go back and find another way out. Just then a rescue plane flew over their heads again. Mark was so excited that he called out for help, but the canyon they were in blocked their position. He watched the plane leave but could not do anything about it. Mark sat on the beach and cried. Even though he was strong, he was only a teenager, stranded on a deserted island for so many days. He was lucky to have his dog to keep him company. At night it rained heavily and Mark huddled in his simple shelter. The sound of wolves howling outside made him unable to sleep. Suddenly, the dog started barking furiously, and a hungry wolf stared at them from outside. But the dog didn't seem to have the slightest bit of fear, and chased the wolf out of the house. Unexpectedly, it was just a ploy by the wolves, and another wolf appeared in front of Mark, bearing its ferocious fangs, and he ran away. Mark saw the situation is not good and quickly ran away. The dog rushed up a few rounds to chase away the bad wolf, so that Mark escaped from death. The next day, Mark set up the trap and fell asleep, leaving the dog to keep a close eye on him. Seeing the prey appeared, the dog was also very excited and woke up Mark. But this time they were lucky to finally be able to replenish a little bit of energy. The dog looked at the meat but did not show a trace of urgency until Mark shared a small piece of it, and then they both greedily enjoyed the hard-earned food. Meanwhile, on the other side, Mark's father and the rescue team finally found the place where Mark had first stopped, and saw the words left behind. His father was much relieved, at least for the time being. They could be sure that his son was still alive. All they had to do was to follow Mark's directions to find him. But it's not easy to find a moving human being in the dense vegetation of the islands. Mark's side is no better, because he can't find anything to eat. He decides to use his emergency supplies. The boy picked up a rock and smashed it against a cookie. Luckily it didn't take much for the cookie to break into small pieces. He picked one up and put it in his mouth. Although it was as hard as a rock, there was no better food at the moment. Mark mixed the cookies with some wild vegetables, stirred a little and stuffed it into his mouth. He was in desperate need of some carbohydrates and could not care less. He and his dog were stranded on a deserted island, and although he had always believed that he would be rescued, due to the dense vegetation of the islands, the rescue planes were like looking for a needle in a haystack. After a day's sleep, Mark decided to find something to eat. He picked up some insects and mixed them with cookie soup, but even the dog wouldn't eat the unpleasant smell. But he forced himself to put it in his mouth in order to survive. Walking through the dense forest with his tired body, he suddenly slipped and fell down the hill, which added to his predicament. But he was protected by the vegetation on the ground. They came to a small river and looked at nothing but mountains. Mark's face was filled with despair when he saw the top of the opposite mountain flickering as if there were people thinking it over. They decided to take a gamble and go to check it out. The dog dragged Mark in front of him and swam across the river with great difficulty. But when he climbed to the top of the mountain, he saw a house. But when he went inside to check it out, his heart became even more despairing. There was nothing in the house. Mark looked around and didn't know where to go. Maybe it was a mistake to leave the beach in the first place. He walked aimlessly through the forest. The dog beside him did not know where to go. Mark has not even the strength to call out. Then the dog came along with a rabbit in his mouth. A welcome relief. And after a good meal and a good night's rest, they went on their way. When they passed through a ravine, Mark had a problem. As far as the eye could see, there was only one way out. Although the branches were thick enough, but the distance was so high that Mark only dared to climb over it. But halfway through the climb, he realized that the dog was still in the same place and did not dare to go forward. So he had to turn around and plan to go back. Suddenly his feet slipped and the moss underneath almost killed him. So he had no choice but to use the leash to hold the dog and pull him forward little by little. However, Mark soon reached the end of the bridge and realized that there was a huge branch at the end of the bridge. It is clear that there is no way to climb over it. Even the dog's face is full of despair. Mark held the dog in his arms and didn't know what to do. At that moment, an airplane flew over his head and disappeared behind the mountain without giving him time to call for help. While Mark was in a daze, the plane flew over again, apparently spotting them on the bridge. It wasn't long before a rescue helicopter approached. But just as they were about to rescue them, something unexpected happened.